Against all odds, this small civilization eventually went on to build one of the most impressive feats of engineering the world has ever seen: Venice. Despite having no roads, no land, and no fresh water, the Venetians managed to turn a muddy swamp into the most powerful and wealthiest city of its time.
Thank you very much to the person that made this video. It's quite an interesting video, and if you think about it, Venice has been here for about 400 years.
Beneath the surface, and how its clever design and medieval engineering allowed it to take over the world. Stable foundations for buildings, the Venetians collected large timber piles from the forests of Croatia and started hammering them into the ground. They drove them about 5 meters deep until they reached a much harder layer of clay.
They must have been incredible craftsmen, because they supposedly did not have the infrastructure to be able to do these things. So imagine, as they're pushing all these wooden poles into layers of clay and then building floors on the top and not worrying about the water level. Weren't worried about the globe, were they then, or global warming? And it's still there. But he said that they're so compressed that, listen to what he says.
To this day, almost all of the original piles are in great condition and are still holding up the city.
So, I've just said, haven't I, that it was about, or I'm going to say that it's about 400 years old, but it's not. It's over 1,000 years old. Maybe those tree stumps have petrified now, somehow in the water, but it says, to this day, almost all of the original piles, that's why I said they were on piles, but it's wooden blocks, are in great condition and are still holding up the city.
To this day, almost all of the original piles are in great condition and are still holding up the city.
I repeat, to this day, almost all of the original piles are in great condition and are still holding up the city today, and it's over 1,000 years old and in salty water.
To this day, almost all of the original piles are in great condition and are still holding up the city.
I mean, when you think about how these buildings were built, what they did to build them in those days, it's just incredible. And what it was is they first built them in wood and then they built them in brick. Now imagine the weight. So they've built this thing on marshland. So imagine they're now putting loads of buildings on it that are maybe 3 stories high. And they're still there today. He's saying there that they pin them because the weight of the front of the buildings. It's just incredible. They were amazing architects in those days and builders. Anyway, let's listen to a bit more.
Expanding outwards like most cities, these islands expanded into each other. At first, boats were the only way to cross between the islands, but eventually the islands grew closer together, and many could be crossed by simply wading through the shallow water on a horse. The next step in Venice's evolution would of course be connecting the islands.
Wow, earlier on in the video, I said that it was about 400 years ago because in the 1600s it was then its most powerful as a city. But look what he's written there. He says there was no bridges for the first 500 years of Venice's existence. So it is much, 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 much older, and they built this much earlier on. Come on, they had to be far more advanced to be able to do this. Amazing feat, Venice.
Surprisingly, there were no bridges for the first 500 years of Venice's existence.
For the first 500 years, there was no bridges or anything there. I just think that that's incredible, because it's showing you that it's much, much older. At the end, I say, because the guy says it's over 1,000 years old. So how could they have built this like this in the first place? Comments, love your comments, please. So, bridges were then the next turn of events for Venice, which seems incredible when you build all these towns here, but you don't have any way of getting across except by horse. Anyway, so this wooden bridge was built, and what it did was it caught fire, so they had to build another one. So they built this one in stone. And look at the weight and what they had to do to get that bridge up. Come on! And it's still there today. And the weight of that bridge. There's tons of it. And then of course the rest of Venice ended up having bridges everywhere, then connecting everything. I don't know if I believe that history at all. The bridges would have been there in the first place, I think. I just added them in at a later date to make it look like it's younger and wasn't going as well as it was for all the hundreds of years before. Obviously, they don't tell you that it's even much, much older and was working and the whole thing, and making it look like it's only so many years ago, really, but it's not.
By now, the city had become the most powerful and richest city in Europe. Everything being bought and sold went through Venice, and the Venetians were making enormous amounts of money. But as business increased, so did the population, and the demand for fresh water was out of control.
So, there was about 170,000 people, they're saying, living on these islands. And they brought water to the islands until they couldn't cope with bringing the water there anymore. And you're like, that's a hell of a lot of people to constantly keep bringing water out. I cannot even believe that either, that you'd be wanting to do that. So anyway, so they had these fields where animals were grazing there, and they took some of them and they made them into these pools to collect water, so that then they had their own drinking water when it rained. Probably doesn't rain that much there either, but it's a good way of collecting water. So they had a well, and that water came from the gutters, not tested or treated or anything, but anyway. And then of course they had to build the well, and that itself is an amazing feat, because don't forget, they can only go so far down because they're built on these piles, I mean on these bits of wood. So there you go. So then it was then able to look after itself with water. I mean, come on. What, with horses and carts?
But there was still one huge problem: waste.
And then after you've got 170,000 people, you start to build a sewage system, which I don't believe. I believe that that would have been built in there. So what he's saying is everybody was throwing things out into the canals, and then if you didn't have a canal, you just throw it into the alleyways, and everything was smelling. So basically, the waste went into these pipes, the wee seeped into the water. When the tide got high, it came in and then took the poo away. And they're saying that the water's so salty, it was like a disinfectant. Yeah, but, or maybe they had good poo in those days, but quite incredible. The very last bit of the video, anyway, thank you very much to Creator, but I just have a little bit of an opinion. I just can't believe that they built all that and kept adding bits. I think those bits would have been original, because if they could build all this, they would have built it with water and with getting rid of waste.
Amazingly, almost all of the incredible engineering that made Venice is still around today. The bridges, the canals, the buildings are all ancient relics sitting on a forest that has held up the entire city for over 1,000 years.